I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside, it's so comfortable, and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off road. The guy managed the group. He was like, "What are you doing in this beautiful car?" I'm like, "I'm going off road." He's like, "Are you sure? Because you can use one of ours." And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, "No, no, 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 we're going to do this." And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
Sometimes it takes a different approach to help you unlock your true potential. Capella University's game-changing FlexPath format helps you learn at your own pace and fit earning a degree into your life. From before you enroll to after you graduate, you'll be supported by people who are invested in your success so you can pursue your goals knowing that help is available if you need it. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show.
Well, first off, Stanley, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Maybe state for the record, what's your expertise on coronavirus?
Well, I've been studying coronaviruses for 38 years. So I've worked with mouse coronaviruses, human coronaviruses, and this new human coronavirus. I'm a professor of microbiology and immunology and pediatric infectious diseases at the University of Iowa.
And why were you studying it 38 years ago? Wasn't it just the common cold 38 years ago?
That's in humans, but in mice, it actually caused a disease that resembled the human disease multiple sclerosis. So I was interested in that. And it turned out to be not just a mouse disease, because what it was is the virus caused an immunopathological disease. So you got disease when the immune system started to respond to the virus. And the same thing may be happening with this new coronavirus as well as with SARS and MERS.
So what is that? What do you think is happening? So we'll start with this, but then I want to kind of pull it back to where we are now. But what could be happening with this coronavirus that's related to what you've seen earlier?
Well, if you always have disease when the immune response is clearing the virus, is getting rid of the virus, then that means that what you want to do in terms of therapy is not only clear the virus, but you want to tone down the host immune response so you don't end up with severe disease.
And how do you do that?
Not easily. I mean, that's one of the things that people have been working on, because we don't know which parts of the host immune response are causing the problem. And if you do it too well, then you may allow the virus to grow more than it would otherwise. So it's a tricky business. It's just that right now it's something we think about. People are trying to do things, but nobody's figured out exactly how to do it.
Well, and what do you mean by, I'm trying to understand because it's a little bit in the weeds. Like, what do you mean by doing something too well? What?
Well, for example, in 2003, people used corticosteroids to treat SARS. They tried to decrease the amount of virus with a drug called ribavirin and then come back with corticosteroids to tone down the immune response. The idea is you get rid of the virus, then you tone down the immune response, patients will do better. The problem is ribavirin had no effect on the virus, so it continued to replicate. And the corticosteroids suppressed the patient like corticosteroids always do. And patients did worse than if they hadn't had any therapy.
Okay, so I'm just curious. Let's take it a step back. I feel like there are a lot of known unknowns and some unknown unknowns. The newspapers keep repeating, and even in the White House press conference, an established reporter repeated this number, the 2% fatality rate. And I feel like that's kind of the critical number that's being overused. And then we could dive in deeper into other questions. But how do we start determining the fatality rate? Is there a fatality rate that's known? What's your guess? Because I think that determines how serious this is versus prior outbreaks of coronaviruses or mutated flus or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's an important point. I think that the number right now is 2 to 3%. I think the numerator is probably correct, the number of people who died from the infection. There may be some people where death is attributed to something else, and maybe the coronavirus has a role, because certainly in China, they haven't diagnosed everybody who has it. They didn't have enough resources to do that. So I think that the numerator is pretty good. The denominator, though, may be way off, because there may be a lot of people who have mild disease who are not being diagnosed. So in fact, that 2% may get down to, I don't know, something under 1%.
Right. And like right now, so the denominator are the number of cases we know about, but we don't know about cases where someone got infected but never had symptoms and simply got over it the way someone might get over a mild cold or even less. So is there any, given also that it's hard to test this and maybe there's no accurate test, has there been any study to attempt to quantify how many people get serious symptoms versus no symptoms out of the universe of infected? Because then we'll start to understand how many infected there are.
No, you can't do that yet, because you have to test a lot more people. In Wuhan, they were testing lots of people, but there were probably lots more people who they didn't test. So you just have to do enough tests. And probably in the U.S. and other countries in the West, this information will become available, because they're doing much more screening, in the sense that somebody, for example, if somebody in the U.S. is known to be infected with the virus, they then go back to all the contacts of that person. And now you can begin to get a sense for how many people have mild disease relative to this one person who presented with presumably more severe disease. But we don't have those data yet.
If you were right, so we don't have this data. So all we know is serious symptoms, or all we know is number of deaths divided by number of people with serious symptoms, and that turns out to be the 2%. But if we don't know the full universe infected, it could be that the number of infected with mild to no symptoms could be 99% of those infected, or it could be 1% of those infected. Do we have any? I mean, South Korea has done some testing over larger groups. What's your gut, given any of the recent data you've seen?
Yeah, so my gut is that it's nearer 1%, that it's going to come out to 1% or less. The reason, so out of those, the only part of what you just said that I don't quite agree with is that out of that denominator, it's not just people with severe illness, it's people who have mild illness who were tested, because they happen to be. So so it's not a completely just 20% of the population being tested. We just don't know how big that group of subclinical and mild infections is yet. But there's hints coming out that it's going to be nearer to 1%. 1% is still high. If you have a huge number of people infected, 1% is a lot of deaths. So I hope it's even lower than that.
What do you think? Given that the direction seems to be that it's going lower, do you think it could go much lower than 1%, like 1/10 of 1%?
1/10 of 1% is at the lower end of seasonal flu. I think this is probably going to be more severe than that. So seasonal flu is considered to be 1 in 1,000 to 2 to 3 in 1,000. I think that, which is 0.1%. And I think I would guess this won't go lower than 0.3 to 0.5%, but that's totally a guess.
Right. What about immunity? Do you think it's I know there's been some cases where people are discharged and they get it again, but maybe they were discharged too early. What do you think there's immunity to this?
Yeah, I think that this is something I've been thinking about, because I think there's 5 or 6 cases I know of like this now, and I don't know what's going on. It sounds like the patients are discharged when they're well. So first, they should develop some immunity. It'd be amazing if they develop nothing. So I don't understand what the recrudescence is. I don't know from those reports if infectious virus was actually isolated. I can't remember. There's the one paper in JAMA is best for that. And I don't remember what it showed. So you want to make sure virus itself comes back, as opposed to viral RNA, which is what we detect with the usual screening assay, the RT-PCR assay. And that's an important distinction, because if you have viral RNA but not virus, you're not contagious. So you need to have virus there.
So I'm not sure I understand. So in these cases, so immunity is a big issue because that's the way viruses like this go away. We could get a vaccine, or the society develops herd immunity, and the virus doesn't come back.
Yeah.
And so things like SARS and even the flu have immunity, and the reason people get the flu again is because it mutates, and this is perhaps a mutated SARS. We don't know. But so explain that again. So someone's discharged and they seem well. Why again? I don't understand why that some of them appear to be getting it again.
Yeah. No, I don't know the answer to that. All I'm saying is that there's 2 or 3 scenarios. One is that they get reinfected with the new version, with the second time again, which would be a surprise because they should have some immunity to it. The virus recrudescing, in other words, being inside the person then coming back out again, would mean that it didn't fully go away, as you alluded in the first part of your question. We don't know the answer to that. And the third thing that I said is we think that the virus seems to be recrudescing, but I just wonder if we're picking up products of the virus rather than the virus itself, because we don't measure infectious virus. That's hard to do except in high biosafety areas.
That's interesting. So what does that mean? Does that mean they might have elements of the RNA of the virus, but they actually don't have the virus? They're not contagious. They're just being picked up by a test because it's sort of like the garbage of the virus is left over in their body, but it's not really active.
Yeah, and that's only part of the story because people are sick on the second time around. So it's not just the garbage. So I don't understand it. I don't have a good answer for this because it would surprise me if there's no immunity. It would surprise me if the virus was hanging around so long. All the possible explanations are not something I expect from a coronavirus. So that's why I don't know why this is occurring. And it's really amazing to me that it is occurring.
Have you ever seen a coronavirus with no immunity?
No. I've seen immunity wane quickly, but not in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. We have a case of people who had MERS coronavirus and then several months later have no antibody to it, but not 2 weeks later or not 3 weeks later. So, the other possibility is they never developed an antibody, that whatever their infection was, it was so light that they never actually developed a good immune response. And so, but then again, the virus if they did that, the virus should have never recrudesced. It should have been gone because the body never saw it. So I'm waffling because I don't know. I think it's very curious, and we need to know how many more cases like this occurs and what is going on, because I don't think we know.
Could it be that they weren't through with the incubation period, but they tested positive? They were put in the hospital, then they were let go somehow, and it didn't show up in a test. I don't know. Maybe when there's no symptoms, the testing is not as accurate, and then they kind of fully developed it after they were released.
Yeah, that's possible. If the test said that they were negative and they never were, then that's a possibility. That's another scenario or version of one of the scenarios that I mentioned. So, but then it's a very prolonged infection. Which is possible because SARS and MERS could go on for people with sick. They could have evidence of virus, not necessarily infectious virus, but these products for weeks. So maybe that's what's going on. Maybe we're detecting people so early that we're doing something we didn't do with MERS or SARS, and we're seeing more of the natural course of how this infection proceeds. That's a possibility.
So maybe if we're detecting it so early, but perhaps the detection's not accurate. So it's so early. Sometimes it shows up, sometimes it doesn't. We let somebody go, and then the full virus comes out.
That's right. That's a possibility. Yep.
And what? And then there's been some question about seasonality. Although this seems less accurate, just because there is warm weather in South Korea and other places where the virus exists right now. Do you think there's some seasonality component?
There could well be. We don't really know. A lot of these viruses like dry and cool weather. Certainly places like Hong Kong don't have too much dry and cool weather, and the virus seems to do fine there. Southern China, the same thing. So it's certainly a possibility that in a temperate area like the U.S. that whatever we have will slowly recede over the next month or two as we get warmer weather. Of course, the concern is that it'll come back in the fall when the weather starts getting cooler and drier again.
Do you think the fall is enough time for us to create a vaccine or a cure?
A cure, probably not. Curing, both those things have issues because curing, I don't know what that means in the sense that A lot of the therapies that people want to use, you have to give very early in the infection. So if most people have mild disease, you might not give it to them. So then the people get severe disease. By the time they have severe disease, nothing may work because all the damage that's been started, just like I was starting to tell you about with the mouse virus, if you start having damage, then you're not going to reverse the damage by getting rid of the virus. And that's been shown experimentally in animals. So the therapy may be tricky. In terms of vaccines, yes, there may be vaccine candidates who may have things that get an immune response. But as we were just talking about, we better make sure we understand exactly how the immune response works and what you need to protect people, because you can get an antibody response. But why are these patients relapsing? Are they not getting an antibody response in the first 2 weeks? What about the antibody response isn't protective? So it's all, I don't think we know yet exactly what we need. We have guesses from other coronaviruses and other infections, but that's still an area that needs investigation.
Well, it seems like I don't want to say this is a mutated common cold, but the common cold is, or types of the common cold are a form of coronavirus, and we always say there's no cure for the common cold. So it kind of makes sense. There's not a real easy cure or vaccine for this. With the common cold, we tend to treat symptoms. So
Right.
it could be the case that maybe the only approach or the best approach is simply treating symptoms once you realize you have it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think developing a vaccine, if this turns, because this is a more severe infection, if we can get a vaccine that gives some sort of protection for at least a few months to a year, maybe by then the virus, if it comes back, will come back only once and then will be protected long term. That's the other thing about vaccines, along the same idea. If this is something that you want to protect for the next 10 years, then we want a vaccine that initiates long lasting immunity. And that's another thing that we don't have yet.
Because we don't even have it for the common cold.
Yeah, that's right. Common cold is even worse because there were studies in the 1960s to show if you took volunteers who had some of the common cold coronaviruses and they had antibody to the common cold, you could infect them with the virus and they'd get a fine common cold again. So it didn't even work.
So what are best ways to treat the symptoms?
This one, the kind of the usual things that people do. If you have mild symptoms, you want to stay hydrated. Probably eating isn't the key thing, staying hydrated and resting. And then if you get sicker, going to the hospital, at least calling a physician, finding out what you can do, keeping the air around you moist. But then seeking medical attention if it looks like you're going the wrong way. I mean, it's the same things with a common cold. It's you stay away, stay out of public. If you're at home, protect the people who are living with you from you. Those are the kinds of obvious things like that. Wash your hands all the time. Have them wash their hands.
Does Tylenol work?
Tylenol will make you feel better. Ibuprofen will make you feel better too. I don't know. Ibuprofen cuts into the inflammatory response, and I don't know if that's good or bad. It might be good. So those things, I don't think we have really information that they make things better or worse. So Tylenol certainly is something I think would be very acceptable to use without worrying too much about any unexpected consequences of using it. With the NSAIDs or the ibuprofen-like drugs, it's sometimes a little iffy. But I think if I felt really poorly, I probably would use them as well.
What about something like Tamiflu or anything like that?
Zero help.
Zero. Okay, because that's mostly the flu. It's a different family. The other number it seems we don't know is how many of the exposed get infected.
Yep, we don't know that. It's what we know is that this virus is more contagious than a lot of other viruses, but we never know that number. We never know, even if it has what's called the R0 or R0 of 3, we don't know about the other 10 people who you might have been around. You know, the infection is, well, the way it works is it's large droplets. So the person who's infected spreads the droplets. They usually drop to the ground within a 3 to 6 foot radius. Who in that radius, if there's 5 people, how many of them actually get it on their hands or something that they then touch their face and become infected? So that would be a wonderful number to know, but we don't know.
Right, because all I'm trying to say is, like, I don't want to be an optimist or a pessimist here. I'm just trying to be a realist, and I've seen in major newspapers the 2% fatality rate reported, and an assumption that 7 billion people are going to get infected, which means 140 million deaths. But then if you look at, there's the ratio of the exposed versus infected, which we don't know, and then we don't actually know the fatality rate because we don't know the percentage of mild coronavirus versus symptoms enough to qualify as, oh, this person has a disease. All we know really is the number of deaths. We don't know. We don't, like you said, we don't know the denominator. It could be 80,000, like they're saying now, or it could already be 10 million, in which case it's a much smaller number.
Absolutely.
So and one thing is, do you think, I guess related to this is, do you think containment or quarantining is working?
Well, I think that people think, certainly it worked in the SARS epidemic. It really worked well there when you had a limited number of individuals and you basically separated them from the population, made sure they didn't infect anyone in their household. In this case, we have quarantining of a whole city or a whole province. And it seemed, people think that it did some good in preventing a huge widespread infection, but I frankly don't know, because in the end, there was enough cases in Shanghai and Guangzhou and Beijing so that you don't need any more people from Wuhan going there at least in China. Certainly in the U.S., the fewer people who are admitted who come from Wuhan and are infected, the less likely there are to be niduses of infection. But quarantining in general only works if you've caught all the people who are infected and you've sequestered them early enough. Otherwise, it may have some effect. But if you're looking for quantitations, we don't know how much it helped.
And the reason this is an important question is right now in Wuhan and in large parts of China, all the factories are closed.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so it's only, my guess is, just from what I'm seeing in the market, let's say another 4 to 6 weeks of this, that's a real serious effect on the world economy. Like it turns out, coincidentally, we were dependent on the Hubei province for almost all of the world's goods.
Yeah.
And it's shut down.
Yeah. No, I agree with you completely there. So we don't really know. We don't know the effects of the quarantining. We certainly know that there are the negative effects. And then it's amazing the number of healthcare workers who went into Hubei province, even though they knew they might not be able to leave. So I think really our hat should be off to them because they make huge contributions. So, but all the things you're saying are true. It's just, it's so hard to, even in retrospect, I don't know if we're going to know what the right thing to do was, because this is moving so quickly and it's so unexpected.
So out of 3,000 deaths, give or take, I don't know the exact number, only all of the deaths except for about 100 have occurred in China. Is that because it started there and that we haven't had time yet to see the deaths here? Or is there something about, there's been different reports about Asians having a certain kind of receptor for the disease that makes it more likely for them to get it or get it seriously? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know anything about the latter, about there being a genetic difference. If I was going to pick on something, and I don't know if it's going to hold up, but there's a lot more smoking in China, and whether that weakens your lungs and makes you more susceptible, that's certainly a possibility. It has never been proven, but it's a possibility. That's the fact. That's a factor. The other possibility is that when we get to the U.S., when Europe or the U.S. starts seeing the infection, there's going to be because there's fewer cases, they're going to be jumped on earlier. They're going to be given better symptomatic management in hospitals, and there'll be a lower mortality rate. So now,
well, do we know if lower if they don't have symptoms? Do we know if they're contagious?
Well, I would think from everything I've seen so far that if you have zero symptoms, I'm not sure you're contagious. I know there's hints of people saying that. But I think the way most diseases like flu or measles are contagious is just when you're starting the infection. You're in the prodromal stage, so you don't really know you have it. You have a scratchy throat, you don't feel right, start coughing a little bit. That's when you have the most virus. So there could certainly be people like that, and those people could then go on to get mild disease, but they may have infected other people while they were on the way to getting mild disease.
I guess it makes sense because apparently this is transmitted. It's not airborne, but it's transmitted through droplets. So when you have symptoms and you're coughing, that's when you're spreading droplets around to the people around you, as opposed to when you have no symptoms, unless you're, spitting at somebody, you're probably not going to infect them.
That's what I think. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So what's your gut on this right now?
In what sense?
In the sense that, again, the most extreme reports are ridiculous, which is 7 billion people are going to get exposed, which might be true given how contagious it is. But then how's this going to play out? Clearly 140 million people are not going to die. It's horrible if 10 million people die. Hopefully it's much, much less. But the panic is such also that every country is getting shut down. The quarantining is so extreme, particularly in China, where all the goods are being made. I mean, in an ideal scenario, in a few weeks, it starts to die down when the warmer weather hits, the northern hemisphere, and we start to see this thing fade out the way SARS did.
Right. Yeah, and that would be my gut feeling as to what's going to happen. I don't think we're going to have 140 million deaths. I think we're going to control it way better than those numbers say. I think that number is that 2%, 2 to 3% is going to creep way down. But on the other side, I don't think we can be cavalier about it and say, oh, well, we know that's going to happen, so we shouldn't pay too much attention. So I think the panic factor is bad. We want to minimize that. In Iowa City, I know that they ran out of rice in Costco because God knows why. So what I like to think is that people should balance keeping their everyday life with being more observant, washing your hands, seeing who's coughing around you. If you're coughing, pay attention to it. Watch if you're in an airplane and you're going to the bathroom, wash your hands after you touch the door. All these things that are the sort of common sense things, but we don't think about because we have to be much more conscious of our surroundings than we normally are.
Have you seen a pandemic, like let's say H1N1 in swine flu in 2010 or whatever it was? Were there similar numbers in the beginning there? Because I remember there was a lot of widespread panic, although it subsided very quickly.
Yeah, so that was different I think it's different because in Mexico there was a high mortality rate, and then as the virus spread, we saw that it was really like seasonal flu. It was much lower. So and we're too early to know if that's the way it's going to pan out. But that one was clearly we were picking up the tip of the iceberg, and then when we got the whole iceberg, it wasn't as bad as we thought. This one feels a little different because there's so much concentration in China, and there's such a huge number of people. In Mexico, that one, this H1N1, as much as anything, was getting more patients, but we have plenty of infected patients in China, and the number there seems to be at 2 to 3% for what we have. We just think we're missing a lot of the patients. So it feels like it's more severe than that.
Although when you say the tip of the iceberg, it could be, again, the same thing here, just because we don't know the full number. We don't, like if there's 58 million people in the province that Wuhan is in, for all we know, the entire 58 million people have been either exposed or infected.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so that's why the best thing is for us to be as calm as we can and be measured in what we do and the other thing that people should do is they should plan in their heads and not do anything. But things like, let's say the U.S. had started becoming more severe. Well, for people who work, it means that they may have to work from home. Children who go to school may have to stay at home. There's things you have to put in your equation. I know my friends in China are not sending their children to school. They haven't been in school since, I don't know when, December, which is driving the children crazy. But that's the kind of thing you have to put in your equation. But,
is that all over China, or just like Wuhan and Shanghai and places like that? Or do you think 100% of China is being affected like that?
Probably not 100%, but I know big cities outside of Wuhan are being affected like that.
Let me see. I guess when do you think we'll start? Like, what will be the first signs, the first actual concrete signs that this isn't as bad as the full spread panic is suggesting it is?
I think that'll occur. I think with any luck, with the number of cases in China may be receding. My friends in China tell me that. I don't know if it's accurate or not. But that would certainly be the first step that things are being contained. Because in fact, if they're contained in China, it would mean that even though Wuhan was hit very hard, and Hubei province was hit, that the other areas like Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou and other big cities were able to contain it. So that would be the first hint that we're on the right track.
Although there's a lot of evidence that we can't trust the Chinese numbers. There's been, and I believe these are total rumors, but that the crematoriums are being overworked. And again, people will make up anything. It's hard to tell at that level who's just making up stories, who's scared, what's going on.
Yeah, I agree. What I do is I tend to talk to my colleagues in China who are trust. So, but what you say is still true because they only know the information that they've heard. So it's very hard to know. I don't think that. No, I just don't know. I don't want to comment on rumors one way or the other. So, but I haven't heard from my friends that there's crematoriums that are overwhelmed with dead people.
And then, is there any way, given U.S. or European data, that we can start to see, oh, this is starting to die down. This is not as bad as we thought. Like, what would be indications there?
Oh, I think then if you start having countries, open countries like Italy has a certain number of cases, and then over the next week, those number of cases don't increase much, or the cases in the U.S. don't increase much. That's the kind of data you're looking for. Places that are really very careful and very open, and you can see exactly how things are going. Going.
There's some countries where it seems like people are getting it without exposure to anyone from China, like in Iran. Do you think they had some exposure, or?
This is the same thing's true in the U.S. There's going to be plenty of people here who don't have an obvious exposure to Italy or Iran or China, and will still get sick because this is a contagious disease. As we've discussed, if you have mild illness, you might still be contagious. So you could be 2 or 3 or 4 away from a source that you didn't even know you were near.
Right. And then how long does it live on a surface? So if someone with coronavirus spits on a doorknob or rubs their nose, sneezes, and holds a doorknob, how long does it stay on the doorknob where it could be infected?
Yeah, so the last part is the part I don't know. It hangs. People can culture virus 2 to 5 days after it hangs on a doorknob, but how much is infectious after the first 24 hours or 2 days, I don't know. In theory, you have live virus though for several days, so it's a concern.
And when do you get actually scared? When will you be scared?
Oh, if I will be scared, or I don't think I'll ever be scared because I live in Iowa City, but I will be very concerned when I start seeing cases increasing exponentially.
In like the U.S. or?
Yes.
Because it has been increasing exponentially with an R naught of, meaning every person infects like 2 or 3 people. Well, that's going to result in exponential increase.
Right.
Unless if quarantining doesn't work, eventually the entire world will be exposed.
Right. Exactly.
So
I don't think that'll happen, but that's certainly one worst case scenario. So the reason I don't, as you were very appropriately saying, the whole problem with doing these worst case scenarios is they sound so awful that you almost can't relate to them. I mean, so it doesn't really help. And I think that at the individual level, people should take risks, do what they can to minimize their getting infection and minimize infecting other people, and listening to what public health authorities say, assuming that they say reasonable things. But that's all you can do right now, and not go crazy, because in a way you have to be a little bit fatalistic about it. You have to just carry on and not be so negative that you end up making things worse for yourself and for other people around you.
And I guess a valid test, which would maybe, I don't know if this would make you feel better, but a valid test would be able to determine in a random population how many are infected with no symptoms versus how many are, what's the percentage of all the people infected who actually have symptoms enough that they get sick? Because again, if that's 10%, then the fatality rate goes from 2% to 0.2%. Exactly.
Yeah, that's the kind of numbers we need.
And are there any tests that you know of that are happening like that? Like, do you think we'll get those numbers anytime soon?
Well, I don't know. It's because the other part is the sensitivity. So if you have a very mild infection, you don't make an antibody response, then you have to catch the person just when they have virus on their mouth, their nose. So it's hard. So
is there an accurate test?
For which part?
For just in general, this coronavirus.
Yeah, it is an accurate test, but you have to catch it when you have coronavirus around. Those patients we were earlier talking about who have mild disease and then got worse disease, those patients, clearly the test is working well. We're talking about people who have mild disease and then don't get anything more. And you have to catch them just when they have mild disease, and it has to be enough disease so that you test them, because you're not going to go and test all 330 million people in the U.S.
Yeah, and how do I know, like, let's say I have a cough. A lot of people have a cough for many reasons. They have a dry throat, they have the cold, they have a sore throat. Nobody's going to say, oh my gosh, I have a mild cough, I think I have coronavirus. Like you're not going to really say that you have coronavirus until you're over the deep end with it. Like it's a hard disease to say it's other than our normal experience.
Right. Exactly.
So that makes it harder for me. Like if I have a cold, I'm not going to allow myself to be quarantined right away unless it's serious. I think that will never happen.
Yeah, and until recently, you couldn't even get tested. So I think the rules are changing a little bit. But if you have no exposure to anyone, you have less likelihood. Anyone who has the disease, you have less likelihood of actually having it, so you won't be tested. So these are all things that are we need to know. We don't know yet.
Well, Dr. Perlman, Dr. Stanley Perlman, University of Iowa?
Yes.
Thank you so much for taking the time. Is it okay if in a few weeks I call you to get a further update?
Yes, I will be in Iowa City. I won't be traveling.
Yeah, I actually am going to be in Amsterdam in a week and then Austin. I'm afraid I'm traveling too much, but hopefully it's. I'm going to sit close to the window on a plane. I hear that's the right technique.
Yeah, and somebody's coughing. Move away from them.
Medications for preventative or other things you're looking out for, other statistics?
Yeah, so you just cut out for a while. The Skype froze, so I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, is there any other numbers I should be asking about? Like, are there any statistics? My main concern is the actual number of infected, because then you know the denominator and then you can figure out the fatality rate and then you know how serious this is. But also, I'm curious if it spreads further beyond Asia. The deaths don't seem to be spreading further beyond Asia.
Yeah, those are actually key questions. We don't know the answers yet, but that's exactly right.
And the immunity question, we don't quite know the answer. The seasonality, we don't really know anything. But we do know the 2% fatality rate is probably not accurate.
Yeah, well, that's what it is now, but it's likely to change. Yes.
All right, Dr. Stanley Perlman, thanks so much for the update, and I will talk to you soon. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Take care.
Let's stop to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Oh my gosh, I love these clothes. Mizzen and Main. That's Mizzen and Main. It really is the most comfortable work clothes. Travel clothes. I had to travel this whole week. I'm traveling for a week and a half, and I just took Mizzen and Main clothes with me. Close out 2023 in style with comfortable, breathable, packable, and machine washable pieces from Mizzen and Main. As you wrap up your year-end goals, enjoy a Mizzen and Main dress shirt that you can wear confidently. I like that they've very, very just nice, solid colors. I don't really like to get all fancy in patterns and everything, although they do have some pattern shirts, but very comfortable clothes, stretchable pants. It's just super comfortable, but they look professional, and you can wear them casually or professionally. I like some of their flannel shirts or untuck shirts. I love untuck. I never tuck in. So again, whether you're shopping for a special someone or giving yourself the gift you really want, I just buy myself gifts. Mizzen and Main is the perfect gift for any guy who works, travels, and or cares about looking and feeling great. As you could tell by my many photos across the internet, I care about looking fantastic. I'm practically a model. And let's be honest, every guy loves to look great. So again, shop now at mizzenandmain.com and save 20% when you spend $130 or more using promo code James. That's promo code James at Mizzen and Main, Mizzen and Main.com.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.
You know what I love about fantasy sports is that even though I'm not going to be a great basketball player or a baseball player or a football player or whatever, I feel like I get to participate and make decisions and use my knowledge of these different leagues or these different sports to compete. So it's like I can pick my team or I can pick my favorite players
and I could use my knowledge to make predictions and maybe even make money. So with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League on Prize Picks. This is a league created specifically for combo projections that include two or more players from different sports or leagues. Want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I've been a guest on his? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Look, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. What? So I love playing it. I love anywhere where I can use analytical ability with my interests to demonstrate some skill and maybe make some money. And I like the game-like aspect. I do wish they had chess as a category on prizepicks.com, but I'll settle for what they've got. Maybe I should make my own fantasy chess league. But in any case, I love Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/James. Use code James for a first deposit match up to $100. That's the easiest $100 you're ever going to make. So that's prizepicks.com/James and use code James. Daily fantasy sports made easy.
So, Dr. Eric Ding, virologist, coronavirus specialist, you want to maybe, first off, welcome to the show and maybe describe your background a little bit.
Yeah. First of all, I want to clarify, I'm not a virologist. So I'm a general epidemiologist. I've been at the Harvard School of Public Health for over 15 years. And, I think this public health emergency of international concern, as the WHO calls it, has grown just beyond just a small epidemic to something that literally will affect very much everyone's lives on a day-to-day basis. So, and I'm very concerned about how it's spreading, not just around the world, but also how it's impacting our local communities. So yeah. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting because it's the impact is a little bit due, of course, a lot due to the virus and a little bit due to the messaging about the virus, which is, I hope we can contribute a little to sort of help people figure out the signal versus the noise. I guess just from your perspective and your research into this, what do you think people don't know right now that they think they know?
Well, first of all, I think there's lots of bad comparisons towards the flu because yes, the flu has been around and makes a lot of people sick and ill, but I think that people are kind of ignoring the fact that we have partial immunity to flu and we have a flu shot, a vaccine that works most of the time. But for this, it's a brand new virus. No one has any background historical immunity, and there's no vaccine. And it spreads faster than flu. And it seems to have 10 times the mortality, at least, than the flu, if not 15 times a higher mortality rate. So altogether, there's a lot of different reasons why this is worse than the flu, even though it's not spread as far yet to date. And there's lots of tricky things where there's asymptomatic transmission. And that means, during the incubation period between when you're exposed and infected and when you develop symptoms, previously, like for SARS, you weren't really contagious during that asymptomatic period when the virus is growing in your body. But for this virus, it seems it is. And that makes containment so much trickier and worse because previously we conquered SARS, by the way, 17 years ago without the use of any vaccination. The vaccine didn't arrive until we actually stamped it out. Because back then, if you took a plane and you got off the plane 2 days later and got sick, they could quarantine you, but then they didn't have to backtrace everyone on the plane when you were still pretty healthy and symptomless. But with this virus, it really kind of becomes tricky because even when you had no symptoms, it could have been transmitting to everyone else.
Well, can I ask you about that, Doctor?
Yeah.
Can I ask you? So it seems like this is transmitted, from what I've read, it seems like it's transmitted through droplets, meaning if someone has it and they cough or sneeze on someone that they're close to, that person is then exposed to it and could then get the disease and so on.
Right. Although
So
I would say not just cough or sneeze, but general everyday talking. If you ever had dinner with someone, you're talking all across the table, the droplets that come out of your mouth when you're talking can infect someone else, even without coughing or sneezing.
Right. So, but if they're totally asymptomatic, and they don't have those droplets that are sort of carrying the disease on them, is there a potential for it to transmit if they're truly asymptomatic? Maybe there's this kind of gray area in between having minor symptoms and asymptomatic.
Right. And that's the thing. It might, because again, having symptoms is only after your entire incubation period passes, which, by the way, is this completely separate issue of how long is the incubation period, and that actually affects whether the 14-day quarantine is enough. But even if you're, say, still perfectly healthy, you've been infected but have not developed symptoms yet, and went to dinner with someone and laughing at a party, ha ha ha, and spraying some saliva around when you're talking, you could still pass it theoretically, because that is what we've seen in multiple studies. There's been over 4, maybe 5 studies now in major newspapers and actual medical journals like JAMA to actually show asymptomatic transmission. So this is really tricky and makes containment so much harder. And for example, the best example is the Japanese quarantine officer goes on the cruise ship that's docked off the coast of Yokohama. He goes there with a suit, with protection. He gets off a couple hours later after the inspection, contracts COVID-19. And same with a firefighter who was transporting these cruise ship passengers. He was protected. He still contracted it, even when they knew of all the dangers and protected themselves. There's something about this that maybe it sticks on like surfaces, that it's even after you, for example, open a door or have a droplet on a table, somehow it can still transmit even after potentially several hours or several days, depending on temperature, humidity, and disinfection. But that was what makes containment so much tricky, and this is why, even quarantine officers are getting it.
Right. So well, this brings up the interesting question, which is, we don't know how many people are either asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. Like if I had a cough, I wouldn't automatically assume I have coronavirus. And, people are quoting this number of, there's this many cases, there's this many deaths. So it looks like a fatality rate is 2%.
Yeah, you can't calculate it.
Right.
It's tricky. The math around this is tricky because, first of all, there's underdiagnosis. As we know in the U.S., there's been a big hiccup with and delay in the testing. And even in China, they're estimating there's 10x, if not even more, underdiagnosis because mild cases are just being turned away or just not being detected at all. And again, mild cases are still, even if there's no symptoms, you can still shed viruses and keeps the epidemic potentially going. And outside of China, they're estimating 3x underdiagnosis. So 8, that's denominator. If you add more denominator, then more mortality drops. But at the same time, in terms of recovered, there's more than half the patients in China still has not resolved. Because to calculate mortality, you have to basically number of deaths divide by total, assuming everyone else has resolved and recovered. But half of them have not, because the mild cases are around 2 weeks long, according to WHO, and severe cases are around 3 to 6 weeks long. And by the way, this is very long. So 2 weeks for mild and 3 to 6 weeks for severe is incredibly taxing to the healthcare system. The China, they're using very high, 2/3 of severe cases are using ventilators, and some of them are using ventilators for 4 weeks. It's really severe. So all that in terms of mortality means there's a lag, because until all the case fully resolve, some of them could still die, and that's why the crude calculation just based on total diagnosis cases and total deaths at the current moment is a tug of war between underdiagnosis that drags the number down, as well as the disease lag that actually could make the number go higher. So this is why the ballpark is between 1% to 3% mortality. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes. And what I'm wondering is what's the and I'm not trying to be an optimist, but I'm just exploring what the range of possibilities are. Like, what's the possibility that the number of infected could be much, much higher than we can possibly imagine, just because most of the cases are either asymptomatic or a mild cough and they cure themselves and they never get noticed. And obviously we haven't tested most people. So let's just take like the Hubei province in China, for instance. There's 60 million people, maybe 78,000 known infected cases, but those are the people who show up at the hospital. What's the chance that it could be millions and millions of people that are actually infected, but just asymptomatic or low symptomatic right now?
Yeah, and that is a high chance, and that's why we think there's 10x underdiagnosis. You just take the number of cases and multiply it by 10 of true number of cases. So that is possible, and there are a lot of mild cases in which people have almost no symptoms. They have a small cough or small little sneeze here and there, and that's it. And oftentimes people don't go to the doctor for that kind of stuff. But the problem is they could still transmit. The problem is they could still transmit, and unless you stop the transmission cycle, it's tricky. And this is why they've done a study of, say, supposedly 100 infected people got on an airplane for 12 hours. This is a study by London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. How many of those people are we going to likely be able to find? They said we'll likely only be able to find 10 to 20% of them. Most of them will actually escape detection and will continue to spread. And
right. So is that 100 infected or 100 exposed?
100 infected, like exposed as in they got infected.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a study from 3 weeks ago. We've actually learned eons more since that 3 weeks, and in many ways for the worse. So I would say, I think it's much worse than we think, because let's just take Iran. Someone did a modeling of this. The fact that you saw 2 initial cases, both being deaths in Iran, that means we're seeing the tip of the iceberg finally coming above the water, right? It's like a volcano or under a sea volcano that's finally boiling over the top. And so someone modeled it. Basically, 2 cases immediately, and the number of exports they have is probably estimated 18,000 cases in Iran, with a confidence interval of 95%, 3,000, 50,000. And lo and behold, in the last few weeks, Iran, everyone and their mom somehow has one in their family, including the vice president and the deputy health minister of Iran. Both have it as well. Okay. And they're not quarantined as well. And so it's just the tip of the iceberg. Same with Washington State. We finally resumed testing. Finally, after we sorted out all this faulty CDC test kit delay issues, they started testing the last 2 days, and boom, immediately they found a death yesterday. And that means, remember, severe cases are 3 to 6 weeks long. The fact that we had a death already upon the first day of testing means, again, it's kind of like Iran. We're literally at the tip of the iceberg, and there's potentially hundreds, if not thousands more cases that's circulating. And there's another study that just came out yesterday. They actually analyzed the genomic sequence of Washington case, and it's actually linked with the Washington case from over a month ago, the first case in the U.S. But these 2 people do not know each other, have no contact with each other, which means this same virus strain, it's not from California or any cruise ship. The same virus strain has been floating around Washington State for over a month, unchecked.
Right.
And that's so scary.
That is scary, but what I'm trying to understand is, given that it does suggest again that the infection rate might be much higher than we realize, and if the infection rate is underdiagnosed by 10x, could that reduce the known fatality rate from the reported 2% to 0.2%, which is around flu levels?
Theoretically, yes, but again, there's 2 factors in this mortality: the underdiagnosis. If that is only true if among all the cases diagnosed anywhere, like take Korea. Korea has the best kind of thing. Assuming no one dies, no one else dies, and the deaths that you have, everyone else resolves to full recovery, and the deaths you have is all you have. And then you, with the underdiagnosis divided by 10, yes, theoretically that's the number. But that is making a whole assumption that no one else of the entire infected pool dies, and no one else gets infected. So it's like, you think of a cohort, this, as you go through this cohort of disease progression, people will die off. And just because they haven't died yet doesn't mean there's zero risk for them dying. And so that number always bumps it up. So if no one dies, absolutely, yes, you could divide by 10 in China, theoretically. But that's not the reality. So what I'm actually really curious is South Korea, because South Korea has the most comprehensive drive-through. You've seen the drive-through testing pictures? It's amazing. They do 2 updates a day, and between 9 a.m. 4 p.m. they'd have 10,000 tests, lab tests run. And South Korea is the size of the population of California, Oregon, and Washington, and they literally go through 10,000 tests just in between the lunch break between 9 and 4 p.m. They're doing like the full Monty in terms of the testing, and I really am curious, what is the mortality like with this full comprehensive testing?
Right. So from what I understand, it seems like the Korea testing is when we're first going to get a much more reliable sense of what the true fatality rate is, number of infections, and so on. When do you think we'll get reliable numbers on the Korean data?
Well, given
that might change the entire messaging around the world.
It could. Right, it could. I would say, first of all, remember, WHO says mild cases are 2 weeks. Severe cases take 3 to 6 weeks to resolve, right? So there's a lot of people who've been in hospitals for like 4 weeks, over a month. So I would say we would have to wait you have to wait for this entire current cohort to resolve. That would say take 6 weeks and add a little data, analysis time. It might take, 8 weeks before we know for sure. Assuming again, there's not much underdiagnosis. We could do also serology. Serology, is basically, instead of testing directly, or the PCR tests currently do a molecular test of the virus particle presence directly. It's a direct test. But serology is eventually people will develop antibodies. And then, they could, even after they clear the virus, they'll still have the antibody, the humoral memory immunity. Just like you've had a virus before, and the next time you see it, you're going to be less sick or not sick at all. So these antibodies will float around your body for several months, and we can actually get a good sense of how many total people were exposed, and which we get at this underdiagnosis. But I think Korea is a really good example. But I want to remind you something. There are a crap ton of people who are on ventilators. China can build hospitals, or even if they're field hospitals, in 10 days, and they can manufacture a huge volume of ventilators and huge staff, and move tens of thousands of healthcare workers from across the country to work here on these ventilators, because they're basically mini ICUs. I don't think America has any hospital. You try to get admitted to a hospital these days, it's almost impossible. America does not have the hospital beds, ICUs, or the number of ventilators and staff to staff those ventilator ICU units. And so the mortality is totally dependent on how aggressively you have these machines. Because right now in China, even on ICU, 50% of people who enter the ICU on ventilators die within 28 days, 50%. So, but is that going to be true in Africa, Brazil? I'm not sure. America, where we have such terrible healthcare system, I'm not sure.
So it's interesting. So just to unpack that, in Korea, the testing that they're doing, we'll kind of get the full picture once this cohort sort of rides through the life cycle of the disease. So call it 6 weeks, 8 weeks to, after you analyze data and so on. And that might give some indication about how, what the real fatality rate is, and that may or may not calm people down. But you bring up an interesting point, which, then just to add to that, when the whole life cycle of this year or whatever goes by, we'll use serology, just like with H1N1 in 2010. We're able to use serology to see, hey, how many people just in general have these antibodies lying around. Could be millions for all we know, which is what we discovered then. And the fatality rate was minimal. It was almost inconsequential. But you bring up this other interesting point, which is even we're not going to really know the fatality rate because the fatality rate may go up in the U.S. just because we're not prepared the way China might be prepared. And so that's a danger. Now, but this leads to the question of, can containment work, or as the head of the CDC said, everybody will eventually get exposed?
I'm going to give you two answers. Containment can work on certain pockets, but I think long term there will be many, many outbreak pockets in the United States. I'm not saying like if you're in rural Montana or rural Arkansas, you're going to get it. But depending on if you live in a major city, go to lots of concerts and go to a lot of political rallies and other kind of, social events, there's a high chance you might get it. So, absolute containment throughout the United States, no, but maybe some localized containment where, it does not enter rural Montana. But I think the cornerstone of public health containment, until we have a vaccine, which will take a year, or finishing these antiviral drug trials, a lot of these drugs were invented for HIV or Hep C. And so they already exist. Their phase 1's done. We just need to do another phase 2 for this viral COVID endpoint, which will take a couple months. We might get some preliminary results. And so that ramp up will be faster. But until these main countermeasures, the antiviral drugs and the vaccine, that hopefully is high effectiveness, because not every vaccine has 100% effectiveness. Like the flu vaccine this year is only 48% effective because of the wrong strain. Until those countermeasures come in, the key thing is testing, contact tracing, isolation, quarantine. That is, and of course, social distancing generically. But without testing, you're literally in the dark. You're driving on a highway with no headlights at midnight. And that is what a lot of what the United States have been going through. And finally, when they clear the roadblock, we found a whole bunch of them really fast, right? And the other thing is, unlike in other countries where testing, Korea is just like giving out free testing, right? And many other countries have universal healthcare systems. Right now, people, they have to pay co-insurance, see a doctor, potentially pay to be hospitalized, isolated. There's someone ran up a $4,000 bill or a $2,000 bill just to get tested. And if that's the strain, no one's going to get tested. No one gets tested, the epidemic is even worse. So
right,
think of it also.
Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was saying, think of you're like a bartender or an hourly worker, and basically, if you get tested, you're basically quarantining off. Is not every employer is like as generous as Facebook and will give free unlimited sick leave. Are they going to dock you pay? Are you going to get paid while being quarantined? Are you going to be forced to use your vacation days? All these are disincentives for people to go get tested. And I think that is a real existential risk that people don't want to get tested.
So let's say there is, well, first off, how far away do you think we are from a cheap home test?
There has been some people who claim that they discovered it or developed it, like a 1 hour test, like a rapid test. But FDA still has to do an EUA, emergency use authorization, for it, and and I'm not an expert on that, so it might take a while to apply for an EUA. And the other key thing is the reason the CDC process is slow is you could test, like testing for the PCR is you have a primer, a probe that will, it's like a think of like a Velcro. It hunts for a piece of the COVID coronavirus, right? And you can find it, you can develop a primer that can search and scan for it. And then, the PCR machine amplifies it and you get a positive test. But sometimes it will have cross-reactivity to other coronaviruses or other, say, an old SARS virus or other common cold. So yes, you could develop a test that is that finds your virus, but you have to also develop it so that it's specific enough that it doesn't get a positive for other viruses. And that is the quality control measure where they have to see, well, yes, you proved you can find the COVID virus, but you have to prove that when you find it, you don't test positive for any of the other viruses that are floating around, because it's cold and flu season. There's plenty of those. And so that is that process of, validating it and all the negative controls to prove that it's accurate enough and sensitive enough and specific enough to this virus. All that, is more than just, development. It also has got regulatory approval. And that's why it takes time, but it's important. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. So on the vaccine stuff, there's some indications. This is all just rumors, like you hear stories here and there. Is there immunity to this? It seems like there's a couple cases where people get out of the hospital and then they get it again. But my guess is these people just were not correctly released from the hospital.
Yeah. So there's There's a rumor of like a reinfection or some biphasic thing. I don't think it's a reinfection. It's just it's you had cleared it in some parts of your body, but then it flares back up. Just like HIV, HIV could be eventually suppressed by these HIV cocktail drugs to below limit of detection, but you're not clear. You still have HIV. And so this virus, it's not the same as HIV, but the key is that sometimes in certain body parts, some body fluids, it could be less than the limit of detection. And right now, China's algorithm for releasing someone is 3 days, no fever, I think, and then no more symptoms, and test negative on the lab test for 2 consecutive days, and before they release them. But again, the testing is not perfect because we've found a lot of people who test negative 5 or 6 times and then test positive. The test is only 50% accurate according to the Chinese Academy of Science for their own test. And similarly, you can miss it on 2. Like, for example, in Washington State, the New England Journal first report back in January on that first case, he had tested positive on his nasal swabs every day. But his mouth swabs, they were some days they were positive, some days they were negative, even though he clearly had it. And some urine and fecal, sometimes they're positive. So it depends on how it's swabbed. There seems to be some sort of differential testing depending on where body part and day-to-day variation. Some days it was positive in the mouth, some days it was not, even though he clearly still had it if you swab his nose. This is where it's worrisome, right? Because the test, you can have the best test in the world, but if your body, it's suppressed for a few days because you're healthy, but then, if you're sleep deprived, if you're immunocompromised, and then the virus can flare back up. You've never fully cleared it from your body. And that is maybe what happened, because supposedly the first Washington case, he's recovered, I think. And did he still transmit, or did he transmit before he had recovered and to someone else, and it was basically this mystery community transmission that eventually led to this more recent case yesterday? I don't know.
But the flip side of all that is that it does suggest that immunity, because all this boils down to will a vaccine work or not. And if the testing is, the more incorrect the testing is, given these stories of people getting reinfected, the more likely it is that a vaccine can work.
I think in terms of vaccine is basically, okay, so testing is trying to find out, like, this, it's a signal thing, right? Like, whether it's a signal in different body fluids or is the signal specific enough. That's what the testing. If the vaccine is to train your body, the purpose of a vaccine is to train your body to recognize this virus with either a dead one or a live attenuated version that is kind of harmless, a harmless version, but wears the same outer coat as this real virus. And so that you recognize it, and next time you develop antibodies for it, and you train it to recognize it, and then when the real virus comes, you're protected from it, and because your antibodies will immediately recognize it and recruit immune system to attack and destroy it. That is a very different issue, and you can go into your body, but you will mount an immune reaction that's so fast that it will put it out and nip it in the butt once you're infected. So a vaccine can still work. It has no, relationship to the testing necessarily per se in this context.
Unless the testing has been inaccurate in terms of correctly diagnosing if a person's over the disease. I think that's what's happening is that people are incorrectly saying, we're done with the disease. And then
I am concerned. Yeah, I am concerned. I am concerned about this, whether a recover when China releases someone as recovered, whether they're truly recovered based on just 2 negative tests.
Right.
Because 50% positive, that's a pretty high failure rate, So 50% accuracy, it is a concern. And that's why CDC tried really hard to find a test that is super specific and super sensitive. And that takes more time than oftentimes an epidemic can allow. So I think.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I think getting the test first out there. I think because the positive signal right now, for the most part, is very positive if you have someone with cold or flu and pneumonia. So I think an imperfect test right now is still the best way to go. But to truly release someone as recovered, I think we have to use a much more sensitive test.
So now, at what point do you think everybody in America is at risk in terms of walking down the street, going in the subway, going to a store, and so on?
If we have community transmission, this is why I don't know. We don't know what we don't know. But this is why it's really key to do the testing and find out, how widespread it is. Because, if you do a lot of these tests, and it's most critically among people with symptoms, because you don't want to test every single random person normally, and because the positive predictive value will drop. And there's a complicated math I can go into, but basically you want to test people with some high likelihood of having it, such as people with flu symptoms. I think if we see community transmission in your area, assuming sufficient number of tests to do a sampling, it's kind of like a census, right? Then I'd be concerned. Right now, what the CDC does, what they're planning to do again now that the testing is resumed and they fixed their little lab error, was they have all these flu labs, public health flu labs, like 40 of them. There's also 50 additional ones that they can cooperate with. And they were originally in these 40 flu labs, they were going to test basically every flu negative sample. So basically, if it's they have the Sentinel surveillance system, which they test all these flu samples from across the country in these labs. And this is how we estimate the flu prevalence, because we don't test everyone because there's huge underdiagnosis. And anything that tests negative for flu, they test for this new coronavirus. And that's gonna, once that ramps up next week, I think we're gonna get a good sense of how many tests, how many samples, how many of the people with flu are actually COVID versus traditional flu.
Right, and even that won't tell you, though, how many people have this COVID but are just asymptomatic. And again, both these things make the fatality rate much lower.
Exactly. Because asymptomatic mild are not necessarily fatal, but A, they could develop, or B, they could transmit to someone who has problems or respiratory. Because most of the deaths are people with respiratory problems initially. But then again, look, there's several doctors, 29 years old, 34, 39, 42-year-old doctors who are in their prime who died. And that's really worrisome. So I don't think it's just those who are super sick. And in the Lancet paper, half the people who were in the ICU were actually under the age of 60.
Now, but here's a question related to that, like, and particularly even with the doctors in China who have died from this. How many, 52% of men in China smoke. And I wonder if this is related to smoking at all in terms of the fatality.
Yeah, it's possible. It is possible. Although they're doctors, and C, a lot of these young doctors who died were actually female doctors too. So not all of them were men. So yeah, I do see that smoking definitely exacerbates it, and maybe China mortality, because most of our mortality estimates come from China. Maybe because everything else is pretty low other than Iran. Maybe China has higher mortality because of this greater susceptibility. But again, there are young female doctors who died too.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading one statistic that it's men seem to be either getting it or dying from it at 3.5x the rate of women, and I wonder if that was related to the smoking.
Yeah, I don't know if it's 3.5x. Maybe it's like 50% higher in this one paper. But yeah, it could be, because smoking in China is just like what 60-70% of men smoke. It's ridiculous. It's possible. This is why I want to see. China has underdiagnosis. Also, China currently I'm not going to say cook the books, but they kind of like suppress it a little, because they don't count lab positive cases with no symptoms. If they somehow catch it asymptomatic, they don't count you. So their official numbers only include the symptomatic lab positives, which is
hence the
terrible.
higher fatality rate.
Yeah, so I really want to see what's happening in Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and other super hyper disease surveillance locations where there's an outbreak.
And again, it'll take about, in terms of the current testing in Korea, we have to wait the 6 weeks for the full cohort for the disease to pass through one way or the other. The people have been tested, and then another couple of weeks to analyze. What's the chance, do you think, this doesn't become epidemic in America?
Oh, you're asking that? What's the chance it doesn't?
Yeah.
It's kind of like what's the chance of not having an O-ring failure at launch for Shuttle Challenger, I guess. I think the question is, what's the chance of zero epidemic outbreaks? First of all, I kind of already think there's an epidemic in Washington State. The evidence, 2 lines of evidence already suggesting that. California as well. So I think maybe I can rephrase the question. What's the chance that this won't be localized? What's the chance that it will be almost like in multiple cities and states across the country? I think right now there's like less than 5% chance that the U.S. will be spared in that way. I think there's 95% confident that it will be many, many states, and there will be many, many states and cities with community transmission not related to travel.
Unless, and this leads to the next question, which is, some people are suggesting some seasonality to it, or that it won't be as vigorously.
Right.
The R naught might go down as the weather gets a little better, and so on. And of course, South Korea and Hong Kong have good temperatures, and it's not stopping the disease. But I don't know.
Yeah. Singapore. I just want to point out Singapore. First of all, Singapore. When the epidemic happened, it's 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit in Singapore right now. And they still had a really bad epidemic, albeit it seems to have died down now. But the epidemic, for example, in Singapore, in nice warm weather, was in a hotel. It was a super spreading event at the Grand Hyatt Hotel in Singapore. And it was that Singapore business traveler who went to the French Alps and infected a lot of people in France. And then went to UK and then went to Mallorca. So, I think the temperature doesn't necessarily matter, especially in our modern world where we're inside in buildings and hotels, and these super spreading events we're not outside dwellers anymore, right? So it can be super warm outside, but air conditioned hotel temperature can still allow even these super spreading events to still occur. So that's why I'm not super confident. And then there's something called the northern hemisphere. Seasons change, yes, but then you have another cold season, in the southern half of Earth. And so I think it's going to come back, long story short. And unless we get it in control, unless we have a super good, high efficacy vaccine, it could become endemic, as in it just comes back year after year like the flu. So this is why I'm really hopeful that we don't just have 60, 70% effective vaccine. We need something much higher, because look, a 50% vaccine is not going to contain this epidemic, because the R naught reproductive number is just, for every infected person, the R naught says that it will infect 2 to 4 additional people, depending on the situation. And that number is much higher than the seasonal flu of 1.3. And, even if it's double, if not triple, you need a vaccine that is highly, highly effective, way above 75%. I would say 80, 90% or more.
And even if we fast track, all the current research right now and the FDA stays out of the way, what's the chance that we can have something like by September, by the next cool weather?
I think antiviral drugs, maybe, because we might get some antiviral drug trial results by the end of April, early May, right? If they're successful, if they're wildly successful, sometimes they'll stop the trial early, and it's like, oh my God, we got to start using this. We can't. There's DSMB, Data Safety Monitoring Board of Trials. There's an ethical thing where it can't be too dangerous, but if it's super beneficial, you can't continue the trial either. So if the DSMB says, oh my God, the trial results are so amazing so far, we need to stop it early and just start giving it to everyone, we might see it maybe by this summer. But on the normal schedule, it will be at least 6 to 9 months. Maybe we can get results in late April. I'm hopeful.
So when you said something interesting earlier, which is that in Singapore it basically died down. What does that mean? And that what can we learn from that? And how does that affect how we're viewing it here in the U.S.?
Yeah, Singapore obviously has universal healthcare, universal testing. So the U.S. has neither of those. Singapore has enormous amount of wealth. They gave every single resident masks, and I think the high quality N95 ones too. It has world-class hospitals. It has, really, really good sanitation and quarantine management system. It is literally the world-class epitome of healthcare and resources that they can dump from this enormously wealthy city, state, country into their population. So they basically stopped the community spread. There's almost no community spread anymore. I think more than half the people have recovered already. The 6-week timer window hasn't even finished yet. So I think Singapore is probably going to be one of the best examples. But can we go with Singapore mortality numbers and infection control numbers as the gold standard? I don't know, because Singapore is Singapore. Nigeria has a case. Brazil has a case. Italy's public health infrastructure is not like Germany, nor Norway or Sweden. So I don't think we can't translate every single country's examples for comparison. And especially the U.S. has the worst situation of having non-universal healthcare, which means, patients will be afraid of testing, the cost of testing, the cost of treatment, and the cost of being forced to be quarantined and, furloughed from work without pay.
I wonder if from a policy perspective, there could be money allocated for, free testing and, benefits if on treatment and so on.
Yeah, this is the thing we're trying to work through, because a lot of corporate companies are asking about this, and I'm working on a policy memo with a colleague. But there's different options. Like there's basically there's some businesses that offer short-term disability, right? Say workman's comp. Can workman's comp short-term disability be part of this? I don't know. And it's short-term disability, and can they just offer just paid leave? I don't know if every small business can, right? Especially if like half your company it has to be basically quarantined. There's Medicare, Medicaid. So Medicare has created a new code for this diagnostic, and as well as a new ICD-10 number for this disease. So they're ready for coding and billing in terms of that sense. The question is, can Medicaid just offer it as a free billing for, like a special eligibility? Normally you have to qualify for Medicaid, right? But what if they just made a exemption that regardless of your qualification, anyone can bill this Medicare code for treatment and diagnostic? And then it will be covered. It will take definitely executive action and maybe Congress to authorize that.
So it's interesting because let's even take the best case scenarios in every way. So the fatality rate is much lower than we think. There's some seasonality, so it'll start to go away eventually. Let's even say public policy adjusts magically to handle a lot of this stuff. Then there's the other issue, which is China has, half the country's quarantined, factories are closed down, and maybe the economy has weeks to go before we start seeing bankruptcies bigger than normal and unemployment and so on. I wonder if the situation is going to start, like China's already saying cases are subsiding, but of course we can't trust that we can't trust many of the numbers in China. And so I don't know how we avoid the other worst case scenario, which is that the panic causes the economy to crash.
Right. It's possible. And this is where a lot of the economy right now is, stock market especially, it's a matter of psychology, right? Right now people are having Costco runs because they're panicking, right? Especially in the West Coast states right now because there's the epidemic. And then because of the panic buying, are they going to basically bunker in? If they bunker in and not shop, and it might reduce the marginal propensity to consume, in terms of the economic equations or in macroeconomics. Yeah. And then that's going to, if you reduce the marginal propensity to consume, basically people are just frozen. They're not going to, just like China right now, no one bought cars. Like cars is almost like unrelated to anything with the virus other than, some minor transport here and there. But people just froze and stopped buying cars because cars is one of those things where there's high elasticity, right? If there's money crunch, people just stop buying cars. But, certain things like bread and milk, there's low elasticity. Even in a recession, people are still going to buy it. So I think you have to look at price elasticity things. The most elastic kind of luxury products and casual and non-essential products will have the steepest crash early on. Is if there's full panic and full concern about this epidemic and full lockdowns. Because I think when schools start locking down, then a lot of the parents who can't work from home may have to be forced to stop working. Like productivity can slow down in many ways, separate of sales-driven productivity, right?
And that's in China. I mean, I'm worried about the companies here that depend on Chinese inputs.
Yeah, exactly. And there was also I was actually talking about a lot of things here in the States too, but I think in terms of supply chains, Apple, you've already read that Apple's highly dependent on those kind of supply chains. Pharmaceutical drugs are already facing shortages. One drug is FDA is not releasing it, but FDA has put out a warning. One drug there's a shortage because their supply chain's been interrupted from China, but they've identified 20 additional drugs that have very, very sensitive supply chains from China that could be at risk of shortages as well. And again, a lot of other imports that we require for our auto parts.
Close.
Close. A lot of things that rely on these kind of, China ramping up is really key. But I think even the American markets, people will shut down and stop buying cars. I think, especially in a cash crunch, especially if there's no paid leave, right? Remember during the government shutdown? I live near D.C. Oh my God! In the government shutdown, D.C. just became like this total cash credit crunch because all these federal employees, all these government contractors had all their grants and contracts shut down, and no one was being paid for like almost a month during the shutdown last year, and it was abysmal, and the price of every commodity and businesses just kind of froze. Restaurants just kind of like were hemorrhaging money. And I think that could happen if there's this workplace slowdown and like huge quarantines and lockdowns.
So let's say there's a best case scenario, which there might not be. I mean, I think the worst case scenario is economic collapse and 1%, deaths of the number infected, but hopefully as low as 0.2%, and the infection rate is not as high as we think. But what's a best case scenario that you see happening?
Best case scenario is that we get a miracle vaccine that right now maybe is faster than even the 1-year world record. Maybe the seasonality really slows down, and by summer it kind of like dwindles away. And by the time it comes back again, we'll have antiviral drugs ready, assuming no drug shortages, vaccines close behind, and basically good testing that reveals that, again, really fast forward, like really forward, good proactive testing that finds cases early before they hit brew and too fast. And I think maybe we could just escape with the hair on our chin, that barely we escape a recession. But I think a potential recession is, if I were to be a betting man on the market, and I don't have that much assets that's in the stock market, I would convert things to cash or maybe crypto. I don't know. So, but I don't even know how crypto is going to react to this. I personally feel like there's too much volatility, or alternatively invest in volatility, interest rate swaps or something.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I mean, there's been a lot of valuable information. I think the main thing is the testing to see what the true fatality rate is. We don't know. We're going to
know a lot more soon.
Yeah, and then we'll also know if this somehow dies down like in a seasonal way, and it gives us a breathing room. Well, if you get the disease now, and there's no cure, and you just see initial symptoms, does something like Tylenol or ibuprofen work to handle the inflammation?
For the infection, I'm not sure, because viral infections are very tricky. You can alleviate some symptoms, but if you take some cold medicine, but I'm not sure if it will actually. Viral infections are very different from bacterial infections, and so I think there is no home remedy per se. I would rather people go get tested than try to hunker it out, especially hunkering it out at home, or just hunkering it out at going to a waitressing job and potentially spreading to like hundreds of people on the job. I think that is much riskier, and this is why we need to support free testing for people. And it's actually a very bipartisan issue, Democrats or Republican independents. So there's no real home remedy. I would just right now focus on testing, and then wait it out and see how bad this epidemic is. I would love to have a follow-up interview in the near future, because we're literally at the cusp of finding out so much more. We just unlocked the testing 2 days ago, finally, after getting permission from FDA and CDC allowing all these state labs to run it. And boom, we're getting this huge wave of epidemic. And I think by next week we'll find more.
Find more what? Find
more cases in many different states.
Right. So cases, not necessarily people dying, but because the testings were available, we'll be able to see how many more people actually have this, but we didn't realize it before.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's already here. We're just literally driving in the dark without any headlights.
Right. And so I guess that's yes, let's definitely update in a few weeks, because I think the main thing right now is that how many things we just don't know, and the media craves to know, and it's that kind of conflict that is creating a lot of this panic.
It is, but at the same time, the fact that the first few cases there was already a death, that means it's already been there. We're seeing like a rewind. We're seeing, it's kind of like when light reaches us from other galaxies. We're seeing as it was 3 weeks ago, not as it is actually where it is now, and that's the danger. But meantime, I think people should stop shaking hands. People should fist bump. Stop touching elevator buttons and doorknobs with your fingers. Try to use a paper towel or use the back of your hand. Just social distancing. I think it's the best safe thing right now.
I like that myself. I hate the bro hug when people get together and there's like
people doing the foot tap right now. It's funny, or the elbow bumps.
I like the elbow bump. I'm going to stick with that from now on. But yes, I will. So Dr. Eric Ding, and you're at DRERICDING on Twitter.
Dr. Eric Ding on Twitter.
Yeah, Dr. Eric Ding on Twitter. I noticed you were providing a lot of updates there. I encourage people to check it out. This is very valuable information. and hopefully in a few weeks we'll have some idea of which direction this is going, because I think the entire world, not just in terms of illness, but in terms of the economy, is kind of, I feel there's a 2 to 5 week window where we need to kind of start getting some answers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you
crossed.
so much. I really
you. appreciate
you responding. I just want to mention on this podcast, I texted you like a few minutes before I called you, and I'm so happy you were available to talk. This has been great.
Well, it's important. So fingers crossed, and I hope to talk soon.
Okay, talk to you soon. Thank you, Doctor.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Are you ready to take control of your future and be your own boss? At Neighborly, we'll help you go into business for yourself, but not by yourself. As a Neighborly franchise owner, you'll join a community with thousands of passionate and experienced entrepreneurs. With 19 franchise brands providing a variety of home service needs, you'll benefit from decades of established systems and support. Learn more about Neighborly franchising by downloading your free guide at go.nbly.com/podcast.